just so you understand, I understand that the sermon is at the beginning of the service today and not further down. It's not a mistake. I'm using a series during Lent that has a lot of thematic kind of material in it to try to paint a theme. And if I sort of do my sermon along that theme line, you may miss some of the nuances of what I'm trying to do if you read all this stuff ahead of time and then hear the sermon. So I'm going to do the sermon first so that maybe what comes afterwards will maybe make it a little bit more of a connection. So bear with me as we begin our service with the sermon and as we move through to a more normal kind of conclusion. As many of you may remember, my life changed significantly on April the 17th in the year 2016 in an airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's wherein I encountered the unstoppable forces of forward momentum and gravity. In other words, I fell, broke my kneecap, broke my wrist in 2 places, and so begins my story of rehab. You know, many of us have stories of rehab. I've visited many of you as you've undergone rehab for one thing or another. And today I'm beginning a sermon series for Lent that's entitled Rehab. You see, Lent is that time of the Christian year where we seek to look inward and to deepen our relationship with God. We focus upon the ministry of Jesus leading up to his final week on earth, which we call Holy Week. And Holy Week leads us from Palm Sunday to Holy Thursday to Good Friday, and from the death on Good Friday to the resurrection of Easter Sunday. And so Lent becomes that time where we sort of take a pause, or at least I hope we do, and focus more deliberately on God. This year I want us to examine Lent as a time of rehab. And I want you to think with me along these lines for a moment. To rehabilitate or to rehab means to restore to a condition of good health, ability to work, or to restore to a good condition or operation. So you see, that's exactly what I underwent following my accident. I went from being unable to walk or to hold things in my right hand to walking and grasping and writing and typing. Did it happen overnight? No, it didn't. If I remember correctly, I went to a combined total of about 90 doctor visits and rehab hours at the Norton Community Rehab Department. I spent a lot of 2016 going up and down the mountain, so to speak, as I drove or had someone drive me. And then following the second wrist surgery in 2017, I spent more weeks going up and down the mountain. I learned that healing doesn't come quickly. I learned that I had to have patience. I learned that I had to have practice. I learned that I had to have a therapist walking along beside me and pushing me to do more and more, to grow stronger and stronger. I also learned that all of this time and effort that I had expended came as a result of just a brief moment that got out of control. One fall, and my life pattern was set for the next 14 months. Such a physical event is very parallel, I think, to the spiritual events of our lives. It only takes one small thing, sometimes to pull us away from God. It only takes one sin to damage the relationship that we have with God and maybe with our friends and with our family. It only takes one thing to destroy us and to pull us away from where God would want us to be. Sometimes then it takes much, much longer to repair those relationships, to mend those lives and get ourselves back into proper order with friends and with God. And so that's why I'm exploring this concept of rehab during Lent. In this sermon series, which, as I say, is suggested by the General Board of Discipleship, they sort of give me an outline and say, here's where you can head with it, now figure out how to get there. I'm going to try to get us there. I'm going to try to begin looking at this concept of rehab, and today the theme is wilderness. Today we look at the traditional passage for the season where Jesus is baptized, where he gets up and where he's taken into the wilderness, where he's alone, where he's tempted by Satan, where he overcomes the temptation and begins his ministry of rehabbing the world that had been destroyed by sin. I'd like to suggest that much like Jesus, we find ourselves in a wilderness. The world in which we live is not conducive to a life of faithfulness and service. The world throws sin blatantly and sometimes seductively into our path. We are tempted and we are tried, and it becomes difficult to stand strong. And so the first thing we need to do as we begin our Lenten rehab is to acknowledge the reality of our situation, the wilderness in which we find ourselves sometimes. You see, when I began my physical rehab, I had to acknowledge I can't walk, I can't lift, I can't drive, I can't climb stairs, I can't take a shower or a bath, and the list of what I couldn't do could go on and on. I quickly came to the realization that rehab was the option that I had to engage in. It was a necessity. I had to undergo it if I sought to gain control of my life and my physical body once again. As we begin Lent, it's incumbent upon each of us to realize that we are in a spiritual wilderness and that we need to face the realities of that. We are separated from God by sin. Pressures at work and home and school take us away from time with God. Involvement in the community takes away from the time that we could spend going to church and deepening our relationship. We get caught up in doing so many things for ourselves and our families that we forget about those around us that might be in need. It's time for us to wake up and see the world that is mostly against us, and that we are lost in a wilderness, not entirely of our own making, but entirely sometimes of our own choosing. And so for this season of Lent, I want us to enter into rehab. This week I want us to recognize our situation. However, just in case we don't, the next sermon is going to deal with the concept of intervention. Maybe I can force us to realize our situation. You know, that's often a step that's required to get people into a rehab program. And then the next sermon, I'll talk about the program itself. What do we need to do to make ourselves more spiritually stronger? In the fourth sermon, I'll talk about the idea of recovery, an aspect of our spiritual rehab that will help us to see what some recovery might look like, what it might mean to be back into a better relationship with God. And finally, I'll close out this series by looking at promise. And that sermon will hopefully remind us that we can be transformed by the work of our rehab efforts and the work and movement of the Holy Spirit in our lives, so that we can begin to experience the fullness of new life in Jesus Christ. I hope that you can plan on being present for these remaining sermons. Next week, though, is Boy Scout Sunday. I want to remind you about that. We're going to receive three of the young men are going to receive their Eagle kits, and we're going to honor them with a meal after the church. And this sermon series on rehab will resume for the month of March. And so I need you now to focus. Focus on where you are right now in your spiritual life. I need you to focus on how you are currently relating to God. I need you to focus on how you're relating to your family and your friends. I need you to focus on how the world and the pressures of life may be affecting your time with God. Think about these things and let them be the starting point for your rehab. You now have to realize how broken you are before you're going to begin to see the healing that can come as you deepen your relationship with God. You have to understand that you're in the wilderness before you can begin to see the path that leads you out.